Hello, thank you for joining us today for this special edition of our Conversations with the Superintendent video series. We are grateful to have our panel here today for this important conversation. As always, we are recording today's session in both English and Spanish, and both will be available on our website at district65.net. Now I'll take this opportunity to allow our panelists the time to introduce themselves.
I'm Anya Tanyavudi, District 65 Board President.
Is Lindsay Ryan, District 65 Board Vice President.
Hi everyone, Devon Alexander, Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Family and Community Engagement.
And I'm Melissa Messenger, Director of Communications. I'm going to go ahead now and pass the virtual mic over to our Superintendent, Dr. Devon Horton.
The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, his prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others. Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King. It's important that I start with that today because we are working today. We have our board leaders and we have staff that are working on MLK, because we know that this message is so important to get out to our community. I want to thank the panel for joining me in today's conversation. Here in D65, we have a reputation for being one of the most progressive equity-centered school districts locally and nationally. The community has made great strides in moving towards an anti-racist culture. The city of Evanston has led the nation in the historical reparations work. There are Black and brown people of color leaders in key positions across the city. Evanston is a sanctuary city that provides services and supports for families regardless of their immigration and/or documentation status. As a district, we have a racial equity statement and policy, a racial equity impact assessment tool, and glossary that serves as an equity lens for our board and administration level policy making. We require all of our staff to attend racial equity training and learn about culture responsive pedagogical tools. We have an African-centered curriculum program and 2A emerging Spanish bilingual education program. We have led the region and state in adopting Black Lives Matter Week at schools, LGBTQ plus Equity Week, and Latinx Heritage Week. It's important that I mention this because we have a great head start and foundation to really be the model city and school district in this global fight for dignified and caring treatment of our collective humanity that can be characterized as a fight for equity. Last week, 2 local news outlets wrote an article about an email exchange between myself and a parent. Given the important role of journalism in a healthy democracy, it's unfortunate and curious that these news outlets did not do their journalistic due diligence and reach out to D65 for comment, and further, that one engaged in editorializing the email exchange in our broader conversation as a district about the death threats and hate crimes that we are being threatened with by saying, it thus seems that parents who argue that schools should be open for in-person learning are being attacked as racist and white supremacists because they allegedly fail to recognize that Black households are most likely to contract the COVID-19 virus than white households. And perhaps because they use strong language. This false conclusion is not an accurate characterization of the thousands of communications that we respond to on a daily basis, nor are sentiments at the highest level of leadership in District 65. In addition to not being in contact for comment, our official district written communication was not quoted or referenced either. As a result, we are here to chat and share with you our perspectives straight from us. We wanted to take some time today to discuss the language that was used and how we as a community commit to leaning into critical inquiry and community connection when discomfort is experienced. In this instance, that includes educating ourselves about language and words that trigger feelings and experiences of racism. In addition, we will share how white supremacy lives in the simplest form. I want to address the article that mischaracterize the communication between myself and that parent. That is a priority. But it appears that those words were cherry-picked from that exchange in order to incite anger around an editorial narrative, especially during a time where things are so delicate in our country. I want to acknowledge that in expression of my response to the communication and engagement style directed at me, I recognize the challenging task of navigating a lack of knowledge about words or statements that create a feeling of racism. Healthy and authentic navigation of productive equity education will continue to be a focus for me and our team in the midst of these challenging times. In my use of the language white supremacist tone, I am describing my experience of enactment that results in maintenance of the social organization of white superiority within systems, institutions, individuals, and the interpersonal engagements between individuals. But I'm happy to say I'm not in this alone. I have a team that supports me, and I have a school board that's been doing this, and we will continue to do the journey. President Tanya Vudi, can you please share some knowledge about the historical context of white supremacy in our country and how it has played out in everyday life and its impact on people of color?
Sure, I'm happy to share a little bit. There's, I think, a great deal of historical context to the way that white supremacy has played out in our institutions and how it comes to bear in our interpersonal interactions, starting as far back as the late 1600s. In the late 1600s, that is when the term whiteness was developed and was codified into law in order to establish white supremacy as the law of the land. And that was to serve as a tool of separation of our humanity. And it's interesting because I was just listening to a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King after the Selma March, and he mentions this exact pattern, that whiteness was established by an elite in order to separate the interests and the collaboration of the folks of the African diaspora from the working class folks of European heritage. And so it was a violent erasure of the humanity of folks of the African diaspora by abruptly removing rights. And that was meant to serve as a deterrent to the folks of European heritage from working in collaboration with the folks of the African diaspora. And that has persisted throughout our history and been codified in a number of different instances. And I think what's important to note in this pattern of codification is that racist progress consistently follows racial progress. So whenever progress in our history has been made to establish the full humanity and the rights associated with the full humanity of African peoples and people of the African diaspora, progress has also been made by those who want to persist in this violent erasure of our humanity. So that has looked like when the enslaved learned that they could escape to the north in order to become free. We then saw court cases such as Dred Scott versus at the Supreme Court level. And those cases were ruled against the folks of the African diaspora to maintain enslavement and lack of access to liberation. Whenever we have found opportunities to use the system to celebrate and honor our humanity, there are gestures that follow to erase that. And that happened also during Reconstruction, when Black senators and representatives were elected to national office, and then we saw the adoption of the 13th Amendment. there were then compromises inserted into the 13th Amendment to allow the persistence of our dehumanization. So the 13th Constitutional Amendment allows for, says that no person can be forced to labor for free, which in essence abolishes slavery. However, a compromise was made that would be allowable in the case of individuals who have committed a crime. And then we saw subsequently the peonage system, convict leasing, where laws were created in communities to specifically target and criminalize people of color to force them into free labor. And then we also saw the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which allowed for the establishment of separate but equal, which inherently was not equal. And we saw following that when Black folks would establish thriving Black communities, such as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, that those communities would then become targeted and destroyed violently by white mobs. We also saw the trend of lynching as a form of terrorism to Black communities, when Black communities would find themselves establishing themselves, standing up for their dignity. One that particularly lives with me is the lynching of Mary Turner, who was killed because she dared to speak up on behalf of herself and her husband. And subsequently, the news outlets reported that she deserved that because she should not have spoken out. She should not have had such a smart mouth, essentially. I think her and Emmett Till really live with me as trigger points of what the violence of white supremacy will do to individuals as a system, but also in interpersonal exchanges. So I say all that to say that, there are some disparaging and derogatory beliefs that folks have as a result of the long legacy of white supremacy in this country about people of color, that those of us who are having the lived experience of being Black people in this country are exposed to from very, very young ages. Common insults to our intelligence, insults to our existence. We're told that we are not smart, that we are not clean, that we are not desirable to live nearby or to be leaders. And so we are commonly hearing these messages. We're told that we're dangerous, that we are inherently criminal or immoral. And as a result, there are triggering words and statements and allusions that folks can make that remind us of the persistent and consistent levels of racism that we have had to exist with our entire lives, despite any of the evidence that we have as individuals that those are not appropriate identifiers or descriptors. We are still left with experiencing those levels of racism and those allusions and those words. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that those of us who are Black people of color are surviving and in many ways thriving in a white supremacist system that persistently and consistently is sending us harmful messages and exposing us to harmful treatment. And that is a part of our lived experience in everything that we do. And given that we live in a diverse community that is seeking to be inclusive and equitable, that understanding is something that we have to incorporate in all of our interactions with all of each other. The lived experience that we are exposed to as a result of white supremacy, and some of the wrong messages that folks have been taught that they may unintentionally replicate also are something that we have to do the work as a community to reflect on and think about how we disabuse ourselves of those beliefs and those behaviors in order to allow us to get the most out of each other and our connections with each other, out of love for our community. And so one other thing I wanted to mention was that Dr. Ibram Kendi talks about microaggressions, and he says specifically there's nothing micro about a microaggression towards a person of color. And he says it's a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse, and that is not minor. He said, I use the term abuse because aggression is not as exacting a term. Abuse accurately describes the action and its effect on people. Distress, anger, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, fatigue, and suicide. What other people call racial microaggressions, I call racist abuse. And I call the zero tolerance policies preventing and punishing these abusers what they are: anti-racist. Only anti-racists shy away from the R word. Racism is steeped in denial. Another quote that I think is really important is by Robert Jones, who also runs the social media platform Son of Baldwin. And he says, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is not, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and humanity or right to exist. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I would like to say thank you, Madam President, for dropping such great knowledge and historical context and connecting the dots. Again, that's really important for us to understand the history. And we have a glossary of terms here in District 65 that the board built out a few years ago in an equity policy. And I suggest those who are watching, if you have not become familiar with it, to please take some time to look at those. But I also believe one of the greatest challenges in our community, and what I've noticed here, is how we define white supremacy versus what it looks like in action. Biz, you are well known in the Chicagoland area and across the state for your equity work. Can you please share some insight on how members of our community can grow and expand our awareness of white supremacy?
I'm happy to, Devon. I want to start by saying we know folks are struggling, and there is not a day that goes by where we aren't working to get schools open. And I want to be clear, because I believe there's great confusion. We're not saying that anyone who wants schools open or advocates for their needs is a white supremacist. We are saying that the way some people are advocating is causing irreparable harm and is rooted in white supremacy. I want to share a little bit about how I was raised, because I think it's a lens that many white people are taught to use to interpret racism and white supremacy. As a white person, I was socialized to believe that white supremacy was the KKK. It was overt, hateful acts. It was cross burnings. It was using the N-word to harm. It was physical violence. And it required a person to be full of rage, and it was always intentional. This definition of white supremacy, and frankly, a similar definition of racism, has been used by generations of white people to deem themselves as the good white people, who would never do any of those things, as opposed to the bad white people who would. In fact, in our current political climate, the encouragement of white domestic terrorism, like what happened at the Capitol, makes it more confusing to talk about white supremacy. Because an image of a person carrying a Confederate flag around the Capitol becomes the poster child for white supremacy. And as a white person, I don't want to be compared to that person in any way. It makes it harder to see policies and practices as racist or rooted in white supremacy when the thing we compare to is insurrection or folks that boldly identify as racist. A definition that labels only the most heinous and violent acts as white supremacy is a way to avoid responsibility. It's a way to ignore racism in everyday interactions. And it's a way to avoid dismantling oppressive systems. It keeps us from holding ourselves accountable when white supremacist thinking and practices show up in us. In order to eradicate white supremacy and racism in our community, we have to be able to talk about it. We cannot solve something we cannot talk about. Look, on this call, all of us are educators, and we take that role seriously. We believe it is our duty to name, to explain, to teach, even when we are under threat for doing so. Because we know if we can't even talk about what white supremacy and anti-Black racism looks like in our school system, then we have no hope for eliminating it. Here's what I had to learn about white supremacy and racism. Racism and white supremacy are best friends. They are never without each other. You cannot have racism without white supremacy, and you cannot have white supremacy without racism. For sure, many of us would prefer to use the term racism or white privilege, but it is important, if we are serious about equitable outcomes for our students, that we be truthful about what we are up against. It is imperative for us to see white supremacy for the continuum that it is. Yes, we are receiving death threats, and we have experienced an escalation that has led to a hate crime. That is on the far end of the continuum, and most of our community has been clear in rejecting those tactics. We've received so many emails that are passionately advocating for schools to open and sharing the struggles people are having. These emails have led to thoughtful and respectful exchanges about our thought process and our decision making. There is nothing wrong with wanting schools open and sharing your rationale. But I have been saddened by the other communications. It's clear that many people read our district communications not with a goal of understanding, but with a goal of attack, where folks do not just advocate for what they want, but they insult and demean. They question credentials, they question motive, and they attempt to shame and guilt. These are what we're calling attention to. As a witness, as a white witness to these communications, I do believe they are different than the communications that are being sent to white leaders. One of the most powerful resources I have learned from and used in trainings is about characteristics of white supremacy culture by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. They identify the traits we are socialized with that uphold white supremacy and challenge the safety and success of folks of color in our workplaces and community organizations. I encourage folks to read this resource and reflect on the ways they utilize these traits. I have certainly been guilty of valuing these things in my life and have had to unpack what using them has meant for me. They talk about perfectionism and a sense of urgency and defensiveness, quantity over quality, a worship of the written word, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of conflict, individualism, progress always being bigger and more, the false narrative about objectivity, the right to comfort. These are all on full display in some of the emails that we are receiving, and I urge you to spend some time with that resource. I don't expect everyone viewing this video to understand what we mean right away. There are so many ways that white supremacy is propped up in our lives, and it's so much easier to use our desired allyship as a shield and say, that's not me, they're talking about somebody else. We must not read about white supremacy looking to absolve ourselves. If your goal is to constantly prove that you are the exception, instead of honestly reflecting on how you may be complicit, it's going to be hard for you to understand our message from where you are right now. I think many people are uncomfortable with the term white supremacy, and the reasons vary. I ask that each of us reflect deeply on your resistance to the term white supremacy. What do you imagine when people say it? How does that image impact your willingness to consider the ways in which you participate? How does challenging our use of the word help avoid accountability and responsibility in our community? How does your discomfort with the word lead you to want to blame and shame people of color, particularly Black people, for their own victimization? What I have learned is that central to whiteness is a lot of shame and guilt. I've been conditioned to feel shame and guilt when I make a mistake. And when I feel that way, I have a choice. to work through those painful feelings and take measures to repair the harm that I have caused, or I can deflect those hard feelings and attempt to shame others. Too many people in our community are choosing option 2. We need to sit with why Black leadership is saying that they are feeling harmed and reflect on how they experience our community. White supremacy is powerful and invested in its own success. We will not be able to eradicate the most clear violations and hatred if we can't understand and interrupt the other end of the continuum. If we can't challenge all of the mechanisms and tactics that are used to prop up those larger threats. We will not be perfect, but we must engage with our imperfections. We must be willing to acknowledge what we still need to learn, and we must be willing to take responsibility when we make mistakes. We must be able to listen and be willing to listen when people are telling us they are hurt. Calling attention to white supremacy in all of its forms along that continuum is not what is popular, but it is what is necessary. Thanks, Dr. Horton.
Thank you, Vice President. That is really powerful. One of the concerns we have here in Evans-Muskogee 65 is that our achievement gap is not reduced, even under such a progressive community. I would like to know what are the next steps that we must take as a district, but also as a community to turn our equity efforts into much improved outcomes. The articles from last week are quite the evidence that there is so much more work for us around equity education. Mr. Alexander, can you address educational racial equity tools that can help us navigate these challenges as a community?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Horton. I want to thank the panelists for courageously stepping into this moment of what is really common patterns in our socialized racial discourse. You know, these are difficult conversations to engage and navigate with one another, and the way in which you're stepping up as leaders to lead our communities through this difficult conversation is commendable. Dr. Horton, to your question around educational tools, you know, we're navigating in this moment multiple educational challenges in this circumstance of the impact of the pandemic on local communities, education, and the socio-systemic constructions of race and racism in our lived experiences. You know, the interpersonal difficulty of navigating these factors in this present moment is often rooted in the differing approaches and context from which we as individuals engage. And absent some real clear boundaries and parameters for these types of challenging engagements, it's often near impossible to overcome the problematic socialized patterns that are common in these social discourses. Combativeness, a closed off position, an inability to hear critically what another is saying. In our work for educational racial equity, there are a handful of tools that we can bring in here under your tenure and really ground on this foundation of educational racial equity work that the district across the community has been involved in. There's familiarity in the community with Ronald Heifetz's adaptive leadership model, really a model just for addressing how we navigate challenging issues, challenging discussions, challenging circumstances. And in that model, him and his team identified this zone of productive disequilibrium that exists between our threshold of learning that acknowledges, that points to there's a need, a continuous need for learning when facing these really broad social problems as they intersect across our systems into our educational institutions and to our professional practice and our lives within these settings. And then there's that limit of tolerance where the distress that we experience in navigating these problems becomes so high that we often find ourselves peaking out, it being too much. And so that zone of productive disequilibrium really offers us a model for how to stay within the groove of the challenge, to continue to push our learning and to continue to self-regulate and monitor the level of stress that we're experiencing, that we're capable of experiencing in some challenging conversations. This is a useful tool that can help us as we navigate these kinds of difficult conversations. by really focusing in on self-regulation. Another that we're bringing into the district is around these 4 healthy racial objectives, specifically targeting educational conversations about race, really wanting to shift the way in which we learned in our American society around race to exist within a state of uncritical habits of mind, some problematic ways of thinking about race, to healthier racial consciousness. And then shifting these patterns of learned combativeness when race is the topic, to engaging with one another in healthier ways of talking about race. That third element is really shifting these patterns of dysfunctional racial engagement so that we can get to a place of functional and healthy racial engagement around the issue of educational racial inequity within our system. And hopefully by navigating those 3, we can get to a place where we really begin to internalize healthy racial frameworks that then help us transform our practices as we intersect with our educational system in pursuit of really grounding educational racial equity in the experiences of adults within our system, and most importantly, our students. In that vein, over the last 5-6 years, the district has really engaged with the Courageous Conversations About Race protocol as a tool for really structured educational conversations about race. As I said earlier, we need boundaries, we need parameters in these conversations to keep us from shifting into those more patterned, combative, and dysfunctional ways of engaging around this challenging topic. The Courageous Conversations About Race protocol offers us a tool for doing that, a really systematic approach to engaging ourselves fully so that we can get to a place of some real critical self-understanding around race and some critical shared understanding with each other as we address manifestations of racial inequity within our school system and within our practice. Lastly, there's a tool, it's a counseling tool. It's called the Principle of Core Strength. Really positions us to recognize the challenge of the circumstance we find ourselves in, but holding to our personal responsibility to respond with character and integrity. Often we find ourselves in these circumstances that cause us to be heightened, that cause us to reach or approach our limit of tolerance and our capacity to navigate that distress. And this principle really positions us to say, I'm going to take personal responsibility for my response in the face of whatever the circumstance puts in front of me, where I'm not going to abdicate that personal responsibility of my response because the circumstance is challenging or the situation is of a heightened nature that pulls me to an inclination to respond in kind. Instead, individuals can choose to maintain that higher manifestation of their character and their integrity, and utilizing this principle of core strength can help us stay focused on that task in conversations like those that have occurred that you all have addressed. I believe that these 4 tools can be really helpful to us in our work to continue the work of really grounding educational racial equity in the experiences of all of us as a community here in D65.
Thank you, Devon, for sharing some of what we're doing here in the district. And thank you all for sharing your insight and perspective. To expand on that, I'm wondering if there are any other learning resources or tools that families, staff members, community should be aware of that you all would recommend.
Sure. I would love to share a little bit more with you all about Next Steps Evanston Anti-Racism Learning Studio. We received over 70 applications to participate in the Anti-Racism Learning Studio this year, and we accepted approximately 40, and we are engaging in a 4-month intensive of studying anti-racism in the local context. and coaching and supporting school teams to build anti-racist policies and solutions to data that they have for their particular buildings that may indicate racist outcomes. So we are engaging in a practical application of theories around anti-racism and practical application of working in teams and working in community to respond to those. And, you know, working through the tools that Devon Alexander, you just mentioned, are a critical part of that when we're working in teams on with difficult and emotionally engaging, sometimes traumatizing content and realities of our lived experiences. It definitely requires that we think about how we are impacted by those discussions, by that data, by those realizations, and reflect on how do we move forward in a productive way for ourselves as well as our team members who are engaged in a learning process. And so that is happening right now, and we hope that the Anti-Racism Learning Studio will be a tool and a space that's annually available for folks to apply to and benefit from. One of the other things that I wanted to loop back to is that we as an administration and as a board are truly engaged in what I would describe as heart work. We do this work from our hearts, from our love and commitment to community and to education and faith in and commitment to the role that education plays in helping children and families reach their full aptitude and potential to for them give back to themselves, their community, their families, etc. And while we're engaged in this vulnerable work of being committed to our community in a place of care, we are also being subjected to racist abuse, and that is to be subjected to that kind of abuse while also being in a very vulnerable place of giving and caring is particularly, I think, challenging. And I just wanted to list a couple of the examples of the type of language that we're hearing that triggers the experience of racism. Hearing words like disgusting, insults, pathetic, nuts, or it being implied that we are ruining the community by our sheer existence in leadership roles, or that we are leading to white flight and that we are the harbingers of decline. Those are racist tropes that Black folks are very familiar with, have heard all of our lives, that we have had to exist among, but also work to dispel in many, many parts of our lives and time periods in our lives. And so that racist abuse feels particularly harmful and hurtful and triggering in the vulnerable state that we are of giving and pouring into our community in ways that are rooted in care and protection during this climate of pandemic and racial unrest and explicit white supremacist violence. So I just wanted to highlight that pattern of communication and why that pattern of communication feels particularly triggering of racist abuse.
Should I go ahead and do resources? Okay. I think it's fair to warn you, my college years were a long time ago, but I majored in history and I minored in Black studies and education. And so if you're asking me about resources, I think learning accurate history that hasn't been whitewashed can shift our perspective and understanding immensely. Anya referenced convict leasing and lynchings and other forms of domestic terrorism. I think any tools that get you to more direct sources and learning about what actually happened historically can be really illuminating. One source that I particularly find impactful is the book and film Slavery by Another Name, that talks about the evolution of slavery from slavery to convict leasing to the current prison industrial complex, and really helps folks understand how the criminalization of Black people was always intentional, and the perception of Black criminality has always been false. It's been that those folks were targeted for the prison system, not because they were committing more crimes. So I can't say enough about that resource, and I think it's important to seek out other resources like that. I mentioned the article, The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. I think that is an important next step in our education for folks that have done Beyond Diversity, that have done SEED, really examining how those characteristics of white supremacy show up in our work, show up in our schools, our departments, is critically important. In terms of films, Color of Fear is an old film. You'll see it from the outdated fashion that they are wearing, but it is a powerful articulation of white supremacy that has stood the test of time, right? It is something that, even though it was made, I think, in the 90s, is an incredibly important analysis, and I think really worth viewing. For those that like podcasts, Nice White Parents, Code Switch, Seeing White, I think are all podcasts that can help kind of layer our understanding. And as far as authors, I'm a huge fan of Brittany Cooper. I think she's doing some incredibly powerful work on a lot of different topics, and just has a gift as a powerhouse intellectual, to still be able to make these concepts accessible is a real talent. So those would all be resources that I would check out if I wanted to continue my learning.
Can I add a couple more books to your list?
Of course.
Thanks. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, I think, is an excellent resource to demonstrate the pattern that I mentioned earlier of racial progress and racist progress, and how that was codified into law and policy making in order to create segregated communities and division, and the myths that propagate white flight at the mere presence of people of color in communities. So yeah, The Color of Law. I think The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is an important historical context. And
I was trying to pick ones that people might not have heard of, but yes, that is a seminal text.
Well, and then there's The Body Is Not an Apology. And I think anything by Adrienne Marie Brown is also really important work, contemporary work. So I just wanted to add those couple.
I'd add a focus on our process, the approach we take, being necessary to really take a process-oriented approach where we work to deepen our knowledge and our comprehension into this next phase of our community's educational racial equity work. And in pursuing that, we really get intentional about investigating and transforming our practice for educational racial equity. Additionally, I would really implore us to operate from a position of extending grace and compassion to one another as we navigate these difficult conversations, engagements, this difficult work of continuing our efforts to ensure that our students have a racially equitable educational experience, one in which, in the midst of their life development, they're experiencing healthy and edifying school experience, relational experience. I think if we take this kind of approach, as we reach this phase of the work, we can really begin to construct a relationally and educationally sound school district. And from what I've learned in my first few months here in the community, that you all are committed to that. And taking this kind of approach where we deepen our knowledge, our understanding, and our practice, and we joyfully extend grace and compassion to one another, we can work our way through these really difficult challenges ahead of us.
And I would just like to say, as superintendent of a district that is so progressive in a community that's so open to moving this work, I want to just let everyone know, and this is no surprise, but I'm human. And there are words that trigger certain thoughts and feelings in me as well. We are all under stress and pressure. And from the hundreds and hundreds of emails that I have communicated and board members have communicated with parents, everyone understands and knows that we communicate with passion consistently. So if there's some opportunities for us to grow as a community and as a school district, I think this is an example. I think this is all about taking an opportunity of a moment that could have been tragic or that was really dangerous, for lack of better words. We need to turn it into a lesson for our community and for our students, for our staff and for our parents. We could have easily just went back and forth and put the emails up and compared what was shared, what wasn't shared, but that wouldn't have done justice. It wouldn't have helped us to move us forward. So to those parents who I was involved in this communication, I extended olive branch to communicate more. We can talk about it. There are opportunities for us to grow. And for those who have reached out in support of myself in the district over the last few days, I thank you. It means a lot to have that type of support, knowing that we are doing our best. We are giving you our best. This has nothing to do with returning to school, this conversation. I want you to continue to advocate for what you believe about opening our schools. You don't stop doing that. But when it comes to crossing, there's a line and there's a threshold. And we, as Devon stated, Biz and Anya, we must find a way to engage in these discussions productively and healthy. And I'm looking forward to continue to work with everyone. And again, this panelist, your expertise was amazing. People pay thousands of dollars to get this kind of knowledge. And so to get it for free, let's take advantage of it. And again, we want to thank our team for coming in on MLK Day to do this production, but I can't think of a better way to spend our time in such an important holiday. And without further ado, we look forward to connecting with our families again for our next round of conversations with the superintendent. Thank you for joining us today. Wishing you all a safe and productive week. Take care.